At exactly 11:47 in the morning, while sunlight poured across the busy streets of Brookhaven, a black single father named Malcolm Reed made a decision that would completely change his life. He had only $23 in his wallet, his refrigerator was almost empty, and his 8-year-old daughter was waiting at home for the lunch he had promised to bring. Yet when he saw a homeless woman sitting beneath a bus stop shelter, trembling beneath the scorching midday heat, Malcolm stopped walking. He had no idea that the stranger everyone else had ignored was hiding an identity worth billions. And he certainly could never have imagined that before the next sunrise, the woman sitting helplessly on the pavement would become the richest woman in the world. Before we begin, if you believe that kindness can change a person's life and that everyone deserves a second chance, please like this video, share it with someone who needs hope, leave a comment, and subscribe to Heartline Stories. Your support helps us bring more stories of courage, compassion, and humanity to people around the world. Malcolm had learned the hard way that life could take everything from you without warning. 3 years earlier, he had lost his wife, Nia, after a sudden illness, leaving him alone to raise their daughter, Zuri. Since then, every morning had become a battle. Malcolm worked maintenance at a small office building, earning barely enough to pay rent, electricity, groceries, and Zuri's school expenses. He never complained in front of his daughter. Every morning, he smiled, packed her lunch, fixed her hair, and told her that better days were coming. But sometimes, after Zuri fell asleep, Malcolm sat alone at the kitchen table counting his remaining bills and wondering how long he could keep pretending everything was going to be all right. That morning, Malcolm had been walking home during his lunch break when he noticed the woman beneath the shelter. She looked exhausted. Her clothes were old and dusty, her hair tangled, and one hand was wrapped around a small black handbag that looked strangely expensive despite being covered in dirt. Hundreds of people passed her without slowing down. Some looked away. Others stepped around her as though she were invisible. Malcolm initially kept walking too, but after several steps, something inside him refused to let him continue. He turned around, approached her carefully, and offered the only sandwich he had bought for himself. The woman stared at him as if she couldn't believe someone was speaking to her. Her name, she whispered, was Seraphina Vale. Malcolm didn't recognize it, and neither did the woman seem interested in explaining who she was. She only accepted the sandwich with shaking hands. Malcolm noticed that she looked pale and confused, as though she had been through something terrible. He asked if she had somewhere safe to go. She shook her head. The city shelter was full, and she had no money, no phone, and apparently no memory of how she had ended up on that street. Malcolm looked at his nearly empty wallet. $23. That was all he had until payday. He thought about his daughter waiting at home. He thought about the rent notice sitting on his kitchen counter. Then he looked back at Seraphina. He knew bringing a stranger home was risky, but leaving her alone felt worse. So Malcolm made the decision that most people would have considered foolish. He told her she could stay at his home for one night. When Malcolm opened the door, Zuri immediately ran toward him, expecting lunch. But when she saw the strange woman standing behind her father, she stopped. Malcolm explained that Seraphina needed help. Zuri didn't ask questions. Instead, she quietly brought out a blanket and placed it around the woman's shoulders. That simple gesture broke something inside Seraphina. Tears filled her eyes, and she whispered that she couldn't remember the last time someone had treated her like a human being. Throughout the afternoon, Malcolm went back to work, while Zuri stayed with Seraphina. They spent the day in the small living room, where sunlight came through thin curtains and warmed the faded furniture. Seraphina gradually remembered fragments of her life. She remembered a private jet, a business meeting, a driver, an argument. Then nothing. She remembered being surrounded by people who always wanted something from her, but she couldn't remember why she had been alone on the street. That evening, Malcolm returned with a simple bag of groceries. He had bought less for himself so he could afford enough food for everyone. Seraphina watched him unpack everything and realized something she hadn't felt in years. genuine kindness without a price attached. The next morning, Malcolm woke to an unusual sound outside his house. Black luxury vehicles lined the street. Security officers stood beside them. Reporters crowded the sidewalk. Zuri ran to the window, confused. Malcolm opened the front door, and a sharply dressed man rushed toward him. The man was Victor Holden, the chief executive officer of Vale International, one of the largest corporations on the planet. His face was filled with relief. He asked where Seraphina was. Malcolm froze. Then Seraphina stepped out of the hallway. The entire street fell silent. Victor nearly collapsed with emotion. He explained that Seraphina Vale was not a homeless woman at all. She was the founder and controlling owner of Vale International, a global empire built from technology, renewable energy, and financial investments. Her private aircraft had experienced an emergency landing the previous day, and during the chaos following the incident, Seraphina had suffered a severe concussion. Without identification or her phone, she had wandered away from the area before collapsing in the city. Her disappearance had triggered a worldwide search. And during those missing hours, the world's richest woman had been sleeping under the same roof as a struggling single father who had barely enough money to feed his own child. But Malcolm expected nothing. That surprised Seraphina more than anything. She offered him money. He refused. She offered him a job. He hesitated. Finally, she asked him what he wanted. Malcolm looked at Zuri and simply said that he wanted his daughter to have opportunities he could never afford to give her. Seraphina smiled through tears. She told Malcolm that money had surrounded her for most of her life, but kindness had become almost impossible to find. She had spent years wondering whether people cared about her or her fortune. Malcolm had answered that question without even knowing who she was. Weeks later, Seraphina returned to Malcolm's neighborhood, not with cameras, but with a plan. She established a foundation dedicated to helping struggling single parents, homeless families, and children who had been forced to grow up without security. Malcolm became the director of its first community center, not because Seraphina felt sorry for him, but because she believed he understood something money could never teach. The center eventually provided meals, housing assistance, education, childcare, and job training for thousands of families. And Malcolm's life changed too. But he never forgot that morning beneath the bus stop shelter. Years later, Zuri would often tell people that her father didn't save the richest woman in the world. He simply helped a human being when everyone else had decided she wasn't worth noticing. If this story touched your heart, please like, share, comment, and subscribe to Heartline Stories. Sometimes the smallest act of kindness becomes the beginning of a miracle. Special request: before you leave, comment, "Kindness has no price," if you believe we should never judge someone by their appearance or circumstances. Because Malcolm learned something that day that money could never buy. Sometimes, the person sitting quietly on the sidewalk isn't waiting for someone to give them wealth. They're simply waiting for someone to see them, hear them, and remind them that they still matter. And sometimes, when you open your door to help a stranger, you don't just change their tomorrow. You change your own forever.